Hello guys, welcome back to my channel, and I have decided that I'm going to show you the Rat Ogre by actually unlocking it in one of my other warbands that I've been playing. This is the Rat Ogre. It is the Impressive, and something to note, it takes up 3 spaces on his own. So if you first get him, it's actually, I was confused for a bit on how to actually put him into my team, or how to even hire him. Because he's always on the top of the 3 triangle-like spaces, you can only recruit this guy if you click on the top space. So if you notice, if I try to hire from here, I don't see the Rat Ogre. But if I try to hire from the top, I see the Rat Ogre. In fact, he's the only option. So, with that said, that means that there is a trade-off when you put the Rat Ogre on your team, because when the Rat Ogre is on your team, you can only have 2 other heroes, one being obviously the Sorcerer, to make him not stupid with guidance. That is a huge commitment to using the Impressive, whereas if you did not use the Rat Ogre, you could have, hypothetically, 2 Night Runners and 2 Skaven, 2 Black Skavens, or maybe 1 Sorcerer and maybe 2 Black Skavens, and you would have probably the equivalent, if not better, damage output because of the 2 Black Skavens. However, today for this episode, I'm actually going to show you the Rat Ogre and why it is good, and sort of what are the trade-offs between, you know, having something like 2 Black Skavens or a Rat Ogre. For myself, I believe that the Rat Ogre definitely have a strong reason for being in your team. There are also 2 major drawbacks that I do not like, that kind of makes it still a 50-50 for me in terms of deciding whether or not I want to include him on my ultimate team. Obviously, I want to level 1 up on my team for the option of being able to switch in a Impressive if I'm fighting against another team that runs an Impressive in multiplayer. But that is not the only way to kill a Impressive, and I'm going to get into this right now. So, if you look at the Impressive unit for Skaven, the Rat Ogre, you will notice that large size gives him some benefits and drawbacks. He gets a little bit of armor absorption, but that's not really that great, because you have to understand that he is unable to equip heavy armor. Also to note, it says here that it decreases his range resistance by 10% passively. I'm guessing he starts off with 21%, because he starts off with 11 range resist, and that to me actually is quite decent, considering he can increase his alertness another 8. So his range resist is going to go up another 8, maxing out at 19. And that's not bad. That's actually quite decent. Also, he has 30% stun resist bonus, so he starts off with 40% stun resist. He also have poison resist increased at like 58, so things like a Weeping Blade can't really do much to him. Or this also includes lots of effects like Warp Poison. It also includes things like any sort of thing that involves a poison or putting a dot on him. He's gonna have a lot better time dealing with that kind of thing, because he can resist it. He resists critical strikes, and so that means that it's a lot harder for enemies to critically hit him. And he has a huge stun resist, which is just absolutely awesome. The reason why he can have all these things is because you're really trading off 2 units in exchange for this 1 unit. So it would be really, really bad if he gets stunned. Because if he gets stunned, you're basically... think of him as 2 units merged into 1, right? So if he gets stunned, the enemy just stunned 2 of your units instead of 1, in a way. He's 2 of your guys, okay? Another thing to note is he's large. His circle is huge. He's going to be able to engage multiple enemies, and multiple enemies will want to engage him in order to try to kill him. So constantly he's going to have to fight in 1v large group situations where he's going to fight against a large group. Now, he has Last Stand, so he can't retreat, but that also gives him immune to All Alone, and then once again immune to All Alone from Unwavering, which kind of is redundant, but it also gives him immune to Fear and Terror, which means he can fight against enemy impressives without being afraid, which, you know, makes total sense. He's also immune to Tiring effects, which means that his attacks don't suffer from using double-handed weapons, and he only has the bracers, so I'll get into that in a little bit. But the main weakness here is the stupidity. He starts with stupidity, you can't remove it. The only way to deal with it is to use something like guidance that the Eshin sorcerer starts with. There, my Eshin sorcerer. I was actually experimenting with equipping the Eshin sorcerer with warp pistols and seeing and then maybe even fighting claws to see if the damage is worth it, or if there are better options than the staff. But actually, at this point, I feel... I will go over Eshin sorcerer in the next episode. I'm gonna just limit this video, to a very short video on the impressive. Well, short as in maybe within 30 minutes. So here's the so that is the basic stuff that we want to talk about, but there are also quite a lot of advantages because he's immune to all alone effects. Engaging him into enemies is a very good idea, because he also fears the enemies. Enemies that try to fight him will be feared. If I can see where this is. Yeah, his passive skill. Enemies who engage or start the turn engaged with this user must perform a fear test. Failing the fear test reduces melee hit chance by 30%. The debuff persists and until passing a fear test on the turn start. Passing any fear test will grant immunity to fear for 2 turns. So basically, he's really hard to hit because unless they have really high leadership and they passed the fear test, they are going to get a huge reduction to their ability to hit him. So, and another advantage to having him is that he has bracers. His weapon type cannot be parried. His attacks go through parry. You know, and that makes sense. If you're trying to block a dude that's hitting you like a truck, you're just not really effectively blocking him. So he can only be dodged, but that really shuts down a lot of defensive options for your enemies. So, with all that said, how do we build him? Well, to start, we need to analyze how he fights. Because he's so large, and because the enemies will want to group up to kill him, he's likely going to get focused. So he needs to have some way of surviving a large group of enemies hitting him. Because, sure, you know, 295 base HP, and as it goes up, it's going to get a lot bigger. But it's still possible to kill a guy when you have 4 or 5 damage-dealing enemies on him, hitting him constantly, right? Eventually he'll go down. How do we let him stay up for longer, right? Well, the traditional dodge and parry is actually not going to cut it here, okay? Even though he starts off with decent dodge and parry, and even though I would recommend still getting some kind of dodge or parry mitigation, his main... the maximum of dodge you can do in 1 turn is with sidestep, and that's at level 2 it's only going to do 3 dodges. That's enough for a small unit fighting a 1v1 fight, or surviving a 2v1 situation. But when you have sidestep on a impressive like this, that only stops about all the attacks from one unit, and then the second guy can just keep hitting him without him being able to dodge. Same thing with parry and the upgraded parry, which is Web of Steel. So truly, you don't want to upgrade, well, you don't really care about his dodge or parry as much, even though you want to put him in dodge stance or parry stance. Of note, since he is engaging multiple units, the best way to tank, I believe, is melee resistance, because this allows you to make the enemy's attacks miss, and it's kind of like your reflexes. If you upgrade this and try to focus on abilities and skills that make his melee resistance go up a lot higher, then he's going to be able to survive a lot more hits because they can't really hit him. And that is also why his effective HP is a lot higher if you have a higher percentage of melee resistance. For example, if he is at 300 HP, just to make the math a lot easier, and his melee resistance is at 50%, then I would say his effective HP is really 600, because of the fact that 50% of the attacks that hit him will miss. So his effective HP doubles at 50% melee. At 75%, or actually at 66% melee resist, his effective HP triples. So that is the math, and so the higher the melee resistance on a unit, the effectiveness of the tanking of HP goes way higher. Okay. And it's really not that difficult on this unit to maximize any particular stat because of just how many skill points and stat points he gets. He gets he can max basically anything he wants, outside of obviously Ballistic skill, which starts off at 3 and is capped at 3. He can't really use ranged weapons. Okay, so with all of that said, let's go into his build. I believe that to start, it would be a very wise choice to get the passive Anticipation, because it gives you more melee resist the more you're getting hit. It will commonly stack on its own, and it can stack as many times as you're getting swung at. So the more enemies surrounding him, attacking him on the same turn, the more tanky or dodgy he becomes and harder to hit he becomes, which makes him quite unstoppable. Just by having a level starting right off, the first skill being Anticipation, you've effectively made him a lot tankier. And then you can turn that into an offense by having him get Retaliation and Swift Counter. This combination makes him extremely deadly when fighting him in melee, because his counterattacks are going to hit a lot more often, and he's going to have a lot more offense points in order to fight back. However, an alternative to Retaliation, I would also consider getting Weak Spot, because it also lets him swing at and attack at enemies on his own, without having to wait for a counter attack. And it goes through dodge and parry. However, just a quick note on that is you already counter all of parry. You already bypass parry. So you're really just getting the ability to go through their dodge by 10% when you're getting Weak Spot. A third alternative to that is Swarm. This requires that your allies are actually engaged in melee combat with him on the same targets. When you do, your hit chance increases to 10%, and your critical hit chance increases to 10%. If you're going the Swarm route, it really has a lot of synergy with Underdog, because when he is engaged with 2 or more enemies, it increases his hit chance even more. So with Underdog at level 2 and with Swarm at level 2, his crit chance is going to go get a total increase of 20%. His base crit chance is already at 17%. And it's only going to go up as you increase his accuracy. So let's say accuracy, you can increase it by 8 more points. That's 8 more % of crit chance. 8 plus 17 is 25%. So that is his maximum crit on his own, plus the swarm chance and the underdog chance for 2 or more enemies being engaged to him. That's another 20% on top of the 25, so he actually gets 45% crit chance. That is incredible, considering that you can also get fatality, so that every time he hits, he increases his hit chance by 4%. And then if you're going so heavily committed into doing crit, you can also get deep wounds, which increases his crit damage by a lot. But that would be the crit ogre build. And I think crit ogre is extremely scary to face against, because you know, once you try to engage him, like, because of his massive HP pool, crit ogre says you have to kill me with multiple, you know, enemies attacking me, because 1v1 I will just eat whatever is fighting me. So the enemy tries to surround him or get more enemies on him, and the moment they do, Underdog triggers, and then when you get your ally to flank them, then the swarm triggers, and his crit damage is just off the wall, so he's going to shred them, you know, whenever you're exchanging hits back and forth. And when you're hitting a crit build ogre, he's gonna counterattack for a huge amount of damage, and just be extremely efficient that way. However, that is not a very survivable build, so there are other alternatives. For example, once you have anticipation, you could also get a more defensive build. Remember what I was saying about getting more melee resist? Well, he could get, let me just double check 1 second. I had my build for him written down somewhere. There we go. So after you get anticipation, you can get swift counter. The swift counter build relies on the fact that getting more counter attacks is going to give him a lot of damage, because in one turn there's going to be a lot of enemies attacking him, and the more you can counter attack, the more damage that you're dealing overall. You'll have obviously less control over who you're counter attacking, in the sense that you'll have less control over the fact whether or not an enemy is attacking you, but when they do, you can counterattack more frequently with swift counter, because maximizing swift counter gives you 50% chance to recover 1 offense points after a counterattack, whether or not it is successful. So that means that if you're going the swift counter with anticipation build, you want to make sure that you're counter-attacking a lot more frequently. And so there is the ability Frenzy, which allows you to increase not only your damage and magic resistance, but more importantly, you will be able to counterattack whenever available. It won't be a random opportunity anymore. It'll just constantly be able to counterattack. So if you're going the counterattack route, a good combination is frenzying him so that he can just keep counterattacking, and just be that thing that just keeps swinging and swinging and swinging and swinging non-stop. And it can also be very scary. The crit build is more focused towards being able to do a lot more burst damage to one target and taking it out quickly, and that is something I also enjoy. So it is a toss-up between these two builds, in my opinion. Now, if you were going a frenzy build, you can look at the conditions for ending Frenzy. It'll last until the user is stunned, out of action, or until no enemies are in sight at the turn start. Obviously, he's going to be in a huge group of enemies, so that's not going to be an issue. And if there's no enemies in sight, that's almost a good thing because, well, you've probably killed them all. So the only things that will end Frenzy is when he goes down in a fight, which is out of action. And stay on this thing, please. And the other one is to get stunned. So what you want to do with this build, if you're going Frenzy and going Swift Counter, is that you want to be able to prevent being there's Swift Counter. You will want to be able to prevent being stunned. There are actually two skills here that allow that to happen. One is Resilient. It increases your resistance to critical hits by 10%, and then maximizes out at 20%, and that relies on Toughness. But personally, I prefer Force of Will, which is, I think, a lot better. Force of Will is in the Leadership column. It requires 15 Leadership, and it will increase his stun resistance by stun chance to 45%. That is obviously clearly a lot better than Resilient, which only increases it up to 20%. And because you have limited slots for skills, you want to be as efficient as possible. So the better of the two, I think, is Force of Will. Granted, it does require that you put points into Leadership, which I think is almost useless on this character because he's already immune to fear and all alone. So Leadership really doesn't give him much unless you are trying to resist fear and what else. The only additional benefit that he's really getting from Leadership is the fact that he will have higher morale, meaning that if he stays up, your team will have a greater chance of not routing while he's still up. That is good. That is definitely decent. But really, if you're going to upgrade Leadership, I think Force of Will is almost a must-have, especially if you're going the Frenzy route. Frenzy being an active, right? So with all that said, if you're going into Frenzy, the combination of Frenzy and something else is needed. I mean, okay, so the Frenzy build would include Force of Will, Anticipation, and Swift Counter so far. Now, obviously, when you are in Frenzy mode, you can't really rely too much on your other actives that aren't aggressive because Frenzy says you actually can't Frenzy says you actually can't use many of your abilities unless it is combat. So most of your non-combat actions are disabled. So having one more passive to really help him A, deal more damage, and B, be able to be more reliable is something that we would really like. And so it could either be a quick incision or weak spot. Both lets him ensure that he can deal more damage by being able to hit the enemy a lot more. Weak spot just gives him a flat bypass to dodge by 10% because remember, he already goes through parry automatically. Quick incision is an interesting get, which allows him to go through the enemy's melee resistance every time he hits them for 6%. I personally would prefer at this point getting quick incision over getting weak spot on this dude because weak spot does not we're not really getting the maximum benefit out of weak spot, whereas quick incision will always lower the melee resist of everything, and everything that he fights will have melee resist, so it's going to be a consistent it's going to give him a consistent bonus that will you will reap all of the benefits out of this particular skill. So let me recap. He's going to have, if we're doing the Frenzy build instead of the Crit Ogre, the Frenzy Ogre will go will go Swift Counter, right? He will go Anticipation, and he will have Quick Incision, and most likely Force of Will, which makes him not be able to be stunned since he wants to keep his Frenzy going. And then he will have Frenzy. Now, he actually has enough points to have another level 2 active skill. Remember, because of Frenzy, you can't actually use any active skills that are non-combative. So you actually need it to be an aggressive type of skill. I would recommend either Overpower or Mighty Charge. Or an alternative to Mighty Charge would be a either Swift Charge or Strong Blow. Strong Blow. So all 4 of these are great things to get on him because, well, including also Kidney Strike. But we already got Quick Incision, so it's really up to you which of these, but you can only get one of them, remember. And Daredevil actually doesn't hit somebody. It's an active that lets you deal more damage for the rest of the turn, so he actually can't use Daredevil once he uses Frenzy. So keep that in mind. Mighty Charge has a lot of drawbacks because it actually makes him less able to have he'll have less ability to hit, right? He has 30% chance less chance to hit, which is a huge decrease, but it does give him a massive increase to damage, so it could be a worthy trade-off. Overpower lets him stun the target for a lot less chance to hit, but you can, when you upgrade it, you can actually reduce that penalty to only 20%, and because we're already getting Quick Incision on his passive, it's not that bad if you've already hit the target once or twice and they're no longer able to dodge or parry, and you've already Quick Incisioned a couple of times, then Overpower actually makes sense, because once you stun them, hitting them is basically just for free. They can't dodge, they can't parry, the melee resist has no effect. Overpower is a really great tool on this particular hero, the Impressive. Strong Blow lets him do another 50% increase to his damage, but the thing is, he's not really getting the full benefit because his parry chance, his ability to go through a parry chance is already at 100%. He will always go through parry, so this is sort of not as efficient, even though it does definitely give him more damage. And if you're going for more damage while he's frenzied, a Strong Blow is quite a great way to go, because it doesn't reduce hit chance such as Mighty Charge or Overpower. Finally, Kidney Strike and Swift Charge are also options that sort of, in their own way, increase your chance to hit. With Swift Charge, you are charging an enemy, and you're able to go bypass their dodge chance by 30%, and it also increases your chance to hit by another 20%. So you're almost guaranteeing that your charge will hit. And I think that is a very valuable tool if you're expecting to charge the enemy a lot. But because I think this is a impressive unit, and he's not going to have to, he's not really going to be able to charge enemies that often, because he's going to be bogged down into melee combat. I think the better get, if you're trying to go for more hitting reliability, to get the Kidney Strike, because Kidney Strike reduces melee resistance by up to 30%, and it has no penalties for how regularly it'll hit. So when you hit somebody with it, if it hits, it'll give them a debuff of 30% of their melee resistance is gone, which is quite a lot. So Kidney Strike is a great get as well if you're going the Frenzy build. So to recap, Frenzy is a great ability to go if you want to ensure a lot of damage and just be able to keep hitting and hitting, because the Frenzy build will have Swift Counter as his way of amping up sort of maximizing his damage output, and also Frenzy gives him magic resist, which is quite useful, as well as the fact that Frenzy gives him a huge damage boost. It increases it by 30%. With the Frenzy build, it also gives, we're also building either Kidney Strike, or I personally would go with Overpower, because getting a stun off is just incredible, because they can't fight back on their turn. They have to stand back up and lose quite a lot of offense points. And so that is my Frenzy build. Now, we talked earlier about the crit build, which started off with you know, the base ability that I would always get, which would be Anticipation, and then after Anticipation we would get Swarm, because that gives him more hit chance and crit chance. And because we're going crit chance, it's good to always get Underdog, because he's also going to engage multiple units, and Deep Wounds. So Underdog, Deep Wounds, Anticipation, and Swarm. We won't have a lot of opportunity to get Fatality unless you don't care about the Deep Wounds and the increasing the crit damage, but you just want him to crit more often. Then I would go get Fatality over Deep Wounds. Just keep in mind that Deep Wounds upgrade his damage by quite a lot. Okay, so, and because you're going a crit build, I think Deep Wounds is just probably better, because we have already many ways to amplify his crit damage with Underdog, Swarm, and Swarm. So with that said, because you're critting a lot, and that is your basically burst damage that you're dealing, and because that is the way that you're building, your counterattack isn't necessarily your main tool, and there are better options out there for actives if you're not going the Frenzy route. So let's take a look at what those are. The number one get for me is the ability called Warcry, if I can find it. Wow. If I can find it. Guess they took it out. Alright, never mind. No Warcry. There used to be an ability called Warcry, which increases the damage of your allies within and yourself within 5 meters by 20%, and I think it's upgradable, which is quite incredible because you're increasing the damage output of your entire team. I thought it was completely OP and off the wall, and I guess the developers thought so too, because they removed the ability Warcry. It is no longer here. Pretty sure it's not a passive. Yep, they took it out. Okay, well, what else is good for crit build? Hold Ground is something that you might consider getting as a overall buff to your team, because of the fact that everybody on your team is going to be dodging and parrying quite a bit. So increasing their chances of dodging and parrying is good, but that's that might be, actually, I'm completely thrown off. Okay, I'm completely thrown off by the fact that they removed Warcry, because that was actually a huge part of this crit build, is just increasing everybody's damage, because he's swarming, right? Because that's part of the game plan, is he swarms, and so that means we're engaging enemies with our team. So Warcry automatically makes sense. Alright, well, the other option that I was thinking about is Defensive Stance, which I believe is here. Defensive Stance is an active ability that lets you increase more melee resistance. Now, because like I said, because melee resistance is so important to get on this guy, because he's engaging so many different targets, having an active stance that lets him increase his melee resistance is definitely something to want to consider, especially because it actually at max level increases it by 20%. Okay, 20% of increase to your melee resist is quite a lot. And because you're really not relying on parry and dodge, defensive stance is quite a great way of going for the ability to survive at the end of the turn. And because we're going for because we're not frenzying, we can actually choose to end the turn in a defensive stance. Right here, yeah. Because we're trying to, because we're not frenzying, defensive stance can be used. So you can actually choose to be even harder to hit and to be able to survive a lot more hits. And then finally, I think it's a toss-up between because we're critting so much, right? I think it's a toss-up between choosing to have a ability to allow you to go against ranged units better, because range resistance increases by a 40%, even though it reduces his movement a little bit. But remember, he has a huge vulnerability to range. Ranged units can hit him 10% easier. So if you give him careful approach, and he's not being engaged in melee, because if the enemy is just trying to kite him and hit him from far away, you can you can put him into careful approach, so that he can just walk through the enemy's Overwatch and have all of them miss, which is quite useful. Although this build is assuming that you're not going the Scout Sorcerer build, which I'm going to cover in the next episode, or next part of this episode. I'm definitely getting careful approach on my Scouts to break Overwatch. So if you're going Scout Sorcerer, then I wouldn't necessarily consider the careful approach. And also because we were doing defensive stance, you can't have one or the other. Or you can have the one or the other, but you're spending a ton of strategy points. So like careful approach starts the turn with like one strategy point, and then it already reduces your movement range by 2 meters. And then if you were to do defensive stance, that costs 4. So you're committing 5 SP, your 5 strategy points that in that turn to these two things, and you're already reducing your movement by 2 meters. So it could limit your mobility by quite a bit if you're trying to get these two together. Another option to get an active is because you're going in this build more for a little bit of weapon skill. Oh yeah, to note, you can actually get 20 accuracy and you can get 15 and 15 on weapon skill and accuracy, which is definitely something you should consider. Having Jaw Strike is an option to be able to kill mages, because of the fact that you're not going into frenzy mode. You're actually unable to have that 10% magic resist, which is actually a huge it makes a huge difference. Having the active Jaw Strike and being able to take out a caster and make their casting chance be reduced by 40%, and their Divine Wrath or Curse chance increased by 30% really just deters them from being able to cast spells again, which is a really great way of actively choosing to shut down magic as opposed to passively with Frenzy. So, you know, it's really up to you which style you want to play, but the Frenzy mode basically makes you not have to, like, not be able to do a lot of actives, so you're just moving and attacking. Which is actually quite simple. Once you go into Frenzy, you just walk him forward and keep attacking. You just depend on the build itself to keep him alive. Whereas the crit build, it can dish out a surprisingly high amount of damage with the combination of Deep Wounds, Swarm, Underdog, and Anticipation being his ability to keep himself alive. And then because you are able to use actives with the crit build, you can actually tank a lot easier using the active of defensive stance. And I would either choose between Jaw Strike or Careful Approach, depending on how you build your sorcerer. If your sorcerer isn't a scout that gets Careful Approach, I would actually definitely consider Careful Approach, because range damage is actually an issue because of the fact that you have so many advantages in melee: the fear, the going through to parry, being able to have a lot of melee resistance of your own. The range is also a huge issue. Now, if you're going to be using your Rat Ogre to fight other impressives and just match big unit against big unit, instead of Jaw Strike, another option is to get Kidney Strike, because like I said, the big units best option to defend themselves is melee resistance. So if you can reduce the enemy big units melee resistance by 30%, then you will have the edge in battle. Okay, you will have an edge over their big unit every turn that you hit him with a Kidney Strike. So that is also another option. But I would definitely always get the defensive stance on him if you're going crit build, because you want him to survive long enough to deal more damage, and he's doing mostly more damage to less targets by having the crit build. So you're actually focusing down one unit more frequently, because of the fact that he's not counter-attacking as frequently as the Frenzy build. Frenzy build just lets you keep swinging and swinging and swinging and attacking with the Swift counter, and the Frenzy being able to guarantee that whenever you have enough points to counterattack, you will counterattack. Okay, so that is an interesting little combo. Other than that, those are my two builds for the Rat Ogre. I believe that it is quite strong as a unit, but keep in mind that you're really sacrificing the opportunity of getting 2 units on your team, 2 heroes, and it could have easily been, 2 Black Skaven who definitely don't lack the damage dealing ability. So I would I would ask yourself whether or not you want to. Also, a thing to note is that if you're using the Impressive on your team and you're going into the campaign, whoops. Oh my god.